Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. I am your host, Todd Embley, and we are pleased to be welcoming to the show Jacob Cooke, co-founder and CEO of WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Jacob is based in Beijing, where he oversees the operations for WPIC Marketing and Technologies in China and broader APAC. There's a lot going on in the region's e-commerce landscape, so we thought we'd bring him in and have him join the program, tell him what he's seeing on the ground over there. So Jacob, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, first of all, tell us a little bit about your summer travel. I know you went back to Canada for a while and then traveled back to China. So tell us a little bit about your trip and how does it feel to be back on the ground in China?
Yeah, it feels great. I did take an extended trip, worked out of our Vancouver office for most of the summer. Also, traveled around North America, visiting clients. So that was great. Some of them hadn't been seen in several years. So it's great to reconnect. Came back to China, pretty uneventful. All COVID restrictions, of course, have been lifted, including that last little test requirement. So straightforward back to 2019 levels. And great. So it was good. And, we're appreciative of how easy it is definitely to get around now because, we probably took that for granted for a lot of the years pre-pandemic.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about traveling internationally, and that's good to hear that everything is kind of back to status quo. What's it like inter-Asia or within China travel for you these days?
Yeah, it's good. The flights, everything's sort of back on schedule. Even the major booking agencies, Fliggy and Ctrip, have reported they're back to 2019 levels. Domestic capacity is there. I'm actually even seeing some newer routes on a lot of the cities that I travel to, like Nanjing. Just an example, there's an 8:30 flight now back to Beijing, and before, the last one was at 7:30. So it's even better now for a lot of routes than what was going on in 2019. So that's great. It's also good to see that demand. International travel also, I mean, if you look at what trip.com is reporting too as well, they're back, to exceeding the demand levels of 2019. But pricing and those types of things are keeping the volume a little bit below. But certainly there's a lot of demand for travel, just still bottlenecks and problems in getting these routes back up because, of course, it's not a lot of planes and not a lot of pilots right now. So I think as those crews that, come back into play, it's probably still going to be we think another 12 to 18 months before sort of international travel is quote unquote back to normal.
Yeah, I think, and it's an interesting statistic that I've seen, the amount of young Chinese that are even coming over to Canada to do their flight school. We're seeing numbers of 75-80% of, the enrollment being of Chinese nationals in some of the schools across Canada, at least. That just goes to show their need and how fast they're growing. I'm curious about planes, though. I mean, or trains. You talk about flying a lot. Do you ever take trains, and what's that like?
Oh, it's great. I certainly do a lot, especially on the shorter distances. There's new train stations. So right, at our office, two of our largest offices in China are in Nanjing and Hangzhou. We now have stations that connect those two offices, which is great. I mean, it's about an hour and 10 minutes, with taxis. I mean, you're almost 2 hours now door to door between those two offices, which is great. So people are coming in for half days. They're attending meetings in both offices. And, we knew that was coming when we chose those locations, but now that that's up and running, that's great. You can't say enough about the trains here in China. They're completely on time. You can show up to the station 15 minutes before they leave and still make it. A little bit longer, quote unquote, in the air, but I think you make it more than make it up with the time that you save in the station and check-in and security and all that stuff.
Agreed. Anytime going from, that Shanghai, Beijing trip, always preferred to take the train. Just being able to get all the way downtown versus having to land in the airport outside of Beijing made it worth it. Now, one of the narratives around China recently has been about weak consumption in 2023. Always kind of makes me chuckle because it seems like people are just looking for any reason to kind of call out China, for pretty much anything that they see down. And although consumption is obviously still huge, you see things a little differently as well. Tell us about how the e-commerce sector specifically is performing and why the opportunity is still so enormous for brands.
Yeah, there's definitely economic headwinds. I don't think anybody is really saying that there aren't, but a negative narrative, has really emerged about consumption. And I think that is just narratives lacking a little bit of nuance. Overall retail sales are actually growing quite a bit month over month, but not quite at the rate I think people expected when restrictions were lifted, because there hasn't been that consumer stimulus that was so prevalent in the U.S. and Canada, other parts of the Western world. But if we look at if we take those expectations away and we look at sort of a sector by sector analysis, apparel, accessories, beauty, FMCG, outdoor, pet, packaged food, we're seeing very rapid growth in those categories. Even in August, actually, vehicle consumption actually returned to growth too, which is also, showing, which is also positive, overall. E-commerce is performing really well again. One report I think showed that online sales in H1 were actually up 13% year over year. And that's with, all the retail opening up in that time too. That's about where we think it is too. I think anywhere between 11 and 13% is what we're seeing in terms of the data that we have access to. So seeing some of these reports, around 13, pretty much in line with the data that we have. I think global data was projecting too, I think in 2023, that about a 2.2 trillion US dollar in e-commerce sales. And that overall is going to be up 10% from 2022. Now, I think that might actually beat it, because we're expecting a pretty strong Q4 based on the Q3 numbers that we've seen so far. And also interesting, 40% of all online global sales are now happening in China. So that projection, I think, in the same report had 11.6 on average growth rate up all the way up until 2027. So, when we see 618 numbers this year that came in around 111 billion, this makes a lot of sense, and it really sort of fits. We've had CEOs, Nike CEO, Uniqlo CFOs, and so many other global executives, if you start reading earnings reports, that the China sales are actually beating expectations. And that again matches up to what we're seeing with a 13% first half of the year. It seems wrong to say demand is weak with numbers like that. People are spending on travel, experiences, and a whole lot of consumer products. So what that tells us really, for consumer brands, is that there's specific segments no other market is posting the same growth numbers as China. So really hard, to see these reports coming out. Ralph Lauren, 50%, year on year last quarter. Lululemon, 79% up in China. Nike was up 25. Uniqlo China, like we said, at 40. You've seen similar reports from Apple and what have you. And these reports, if you're following them, really talk about the consumer being back. Aggregated numbers, from what we see, there is weakness specifically related to the real estate the real estate decline, in that we see furniture way down. We see home appliances down, and things that would go into a new home being down. When we remove that, we're still in double-digit growth in almost every other category. So
why is it that growth is so important? Why can't volume and size of market be enough? And I don't know which way you're going to go with that, but it just seems like if we're not seeing double-digit growth, it's all hands off, which to me just doesn't seem to make sense.
No, it really doesn't. And I think there's just been a narrative out there that people have wanted to follow, where they're just looking for the bad news inside the media. It really doesn't match facts on the ground. It doesn't match the earnings reports that corporations are putting out. And really, I'm not in those newsrooms. I really can't explain why we just see this, avalanche of really negative data coming from media at the same time, report after report after report. I haven't seen actually anybody's financial earnings report come out with disappointing China numbers this year, except a couple of auto companies. But, I think that's more due to product market fit than it certainly is if you have a rising vehicle market, or electric car subsidies, for example. But it is tough, Todd. It's a good question. We don't know. It certainly, again, just doesn't match what we're seeing on the ground. And, another thing, just going back to the travel, as it's been opening up, I'm now seeing, in a travel business, I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that. I'm back to seeing 50% of business class being foreign executives now, both on trains and airplanes. And that, for years, it was just me on every flight during COVID. So they're going to see this. They're going to start seeing their numbers. And I just think that narrative is going to fall apart pretty quickly. It's really not going to match what people are seeing on the ground.
Yeah, I have this feeling that even just the number of expats living in China or moving to China is going to start to go way back up again. I thought it was big for a while, and then we hit this kind of high, maybe this 2015 high, 500,000 foreigners, talked about living just in Shanghai alone. and then, you know, everything kind of dropped. COVID was a massive reason why. But I do think that, you know, a lot of people are going to start heading back to China for sure. And what you said about the amount of international business and business class being filled with international foreign flyers being in country, that's definitely in agreement with what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, you know, and it's going to differ city by city, but we certainly have already seen that in Beijing. I think Shanghai, just due to the damage caused by the lockdowns and especially the families with young children that were there, I think that's going to take a little bit of time for them to come back. But yeah, I think that expat community in Beijing is actually larger now than it was pre-pandemic.
What, a little outside the box here, but what cities inside China interest you beyond, you know, the top 5 or what have you that everybody knows? What are some cities and what's going on as far as like markets and growth and purchasing consumption, all that kind of stuff, factories, foreign direct investment, even local, you know, investment going on? What cities are really interesting to you in China?
Yeah, it's very different. You know, it's a really mixed bag. I've started to get out of sort of that normal 4 or 5 cities that I go to too, and I've seen some really great growth. I'm actually headed to Dalian a little bit later today. Hangzhou, number 1. I think that city has just been booming. You know, they've got the Asian Games coming up in a couple of weeks, but just in terms of what goes on in that city, in terms of AI research, biotech research, e-commerce research, of course, it's hard to get office space. You know, new constructions or construction starts in Hangzhou are still booming. And I think that whole region, really sort of Zhejiang, Jiangsu, maybe a little bit more high on the higher end of manufacturing, is doing really, really well. I was talking to a colleague who was down in the Guangdong region as well. Much slower to come back there. And I think you've seen some of the export numbers, especially for what we would say a little bit lower down on the supply chain or the value add. And it's just going to be a cycle of maybe those factories are no longer competitive for some of the stuff they're making compared to what's going on in Asia, maybe Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. And they're just going to be retooling and moving up the value chain. So that process is going on, maybe more in the deep south. So yeah, I would expect it just to be uneven, but certainly what we see in the middle in the 2 provinces outside of Shanghai and Zhejiang and Jiangsu, absolutely boom times.
Yeah. I mean, Zhejiang, huge. Obviously, Alibaba's kind of home, just outside of Shanghai as well, just the other direction of Nanjing. And, you know, when they went IPO and created 10,000 millionaires and that halo effect and all the investment, and I know a ton of companies were going there, pretty amazing university over there as well. Quick shout out to Dalian. Dalian is where I spent 5 years of my time in China as well, so very familiar with that place. And for reference, for people who don't know the area as well as Jacob might, the Guangdong region, that's that corridor between Guangzhou and Shenzhen, right? Up and down the big kind of manufacturing corridor down there as well. So
yeah, the PRD, they're calling it the Pearl River Delta there, right there, that region.
Another, a name people might be a little bit more familiar with. Good segue into talking about Alibaba. I'm just going to kind of softball this one out. What is going on over at China's largest e-commerce platform?
Yeah, a little bit of a surprise over the weekend when Daniel Zhang stepped down, really as head of the cloud division, which was the new position. You know, they had just completed a leadership transition that was announced in the summer. We talked about that, I think, a couple months ago on the show, where Joseph Tsai became the chairman, Eddie Wu, CEO of the overall group, and Zhang was shifting over to cloud. His departure did come as a surprise. I think when the original leadership was announced, we didn't see Zhang's move to cloud as really a demotion, like everyone else did, since the $11 billion business is one of Alibaba's most important. It's doing groundbreaking work in AI, and it's also, you know, where we see a lot of the growth coming in the future. Investors, obviously, when that news hit, didn't like the surprise leadership change. Eddie Wu is more of a qualified to serve as the acting chairman and CEO of the cloud business, though. You know, due to his background, a new management team, I think, needs to still be appointed. But our understanding is today's news doesn't really impact the spin-off plan for the IPO or the timeline related to that. So I think that overall is still on track. You know, we're still very optimistic on Alibaba overall. You know, despite economic headwinds, Chinese e-commerce sales continue to perform really well. And the regulatory pressure that Alibaba was going through over the last couple of years, you know, it's been lifted. So the group's most recent quarterly earnings were very strong. Your overall revenue was up 14% year on year. Domestic e-commerce up 12 year on year. So they're right there, with the market. And, new content pricing strategy has succeeded at really pushing back, against the low cost platforms like Pinduoduo and Douyin. And really, if you look at also the Taobao, I think that their DAUs were way up as well. So pretty positive. It's a great company. It's full of very, very smart people, and it's very well run. We've benefited from that, at WPIC quite a bit.
Yeah. For investors out there, don't sleep on Aliyun for sure. Pay attention to that. And Joseph, that Jake, calling you your brother's name. I wanted to ask you about, as somebody who tends to deep dive into earnings reports and financial statements, and somebody who this is almost what you do on vacation. It's a hobby of yours. You love this stuff, and you go right into it. What could you gift some of our audience as far as what are the things that you take away from those? What are the data points? What are the metrics that you key in on? What do you kind of ignore as noise that other people might pay attention to? And what do you really kind of key in on that maybe might surprise some listeners when you're kind of looking at gaining an edge in China?
Yeah. So when we hear, when the March consumer spending report was up 18% and the red flags were going all over, major media talking about how big a disappointment it was, is just really indicative of how we have to get our information here. So when I'm looking for how the economy is doing or should we be investing further, what are the appropriate levels of investment in the market, I'm really looking at those earnings reports. And I want especially to look at the companies that are going to pull out China and more regional APAC numbers that we can get a good deep dive into. Audited financial results, those are excellent data points. Some of even the numbers that are put out, even US inflation numbers, quite frankly, when they're put out, they're basically just estimates, right? And across a ton of data points, and they can be reasonably accurate, but nothing I think is better than sort of big four audited financials. And that's really what I'm looking for all the time to just gauge the health of the consumer. And we leaned in, even what we were seeing in Q1 results, Apple was the first one, I think, to come out and see the boom. And then Nike, I think, followed, was the next one. And we were just like, yeah, it's on. And we continue to invest. We continue to expand. We continue to hire. And really now we're having an excellent Q3, like beyond our wildest imaginations. We're really the biggest problems now for a lot of the brands that we're managing is just get enough inventory. And, we've had those problems in the past, but, those are the good problems, really.
Yeah. And somebody else who helps manage all that growth is the guy whose name that I mistook you for, which is your brother, Joseph, who's also a co-founder.
It's not the first time.
So,
yeah.
I mean, it's a family-run business, and sometimes that's going to happen. My mom she gets my name right in about the sixth try. I wanted to ask you about what you make of the latest scandal involving Li Jiaqi.
Yeah, it's boy, we've just got through. I think he's just been on the air for about 4 or 5 months. I mean, for those who don't know, essentially he lost his temper on air, and he's a massive influencer. Like, he is the guy right now. I mean, he started this massive movement. He's responsible for probably, I wouldn't be surprised if it's like single-digit percentage points now up to that of the overall Chinese economy, certainly consumer consumption. It's a massive economic mover. I think where he kind of lost his temper on air after a viewer made a comment on, was it fluorescent eyebrow pencils? And I think he said they were expensive at about 79 renminbi. And that's about $10. And I think his comment was, if people find that expensive, maybe they aren't working hard enough or something like that. And that really touched a nerve, because he is, of course, a billionaire several times over. And I think that maybe people were just thinking that he was really losing touch with his consumer base. And quite frankly, 79 renminbi, it could be a lot for an eyebrow pencil. So, he's taking a lot of heat for that. It's probably not enough to get him taken off the air, but, apologies are going to be issued and what have you. And we expect a course correction, but we're not expecting this to be fatal. At that viewership level where you really have millions and millions and millions of people tuning in on every day, those words are watched very carefully, and that show is almost entirely improvised, and things like this, quite frankly, are going to happen. So, it's a scandal, but it's not as big as the last one.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I would find $10 for an eyebrow pencil to be expensive anywhere
Yeah,
for
yeah.
me.
And you know, like, yeah. I mean, I'm not quite in that market, but I'll
Yeah,
take your word for it.
that's a lot of why I was saying that too. Um, you know, there's a new market for WPIC, and we're going to jump
Hmm.
across the pond a little bit, and I want to talk about South Korea. Just give us an overall view of the landscape there.
Yeah, it is, and we're very happy. You know, we're going to be announcing some of the hires that we've made there too. Real power team that we've got in Seoul. Yeah, staggering 120 billion in annual online sales for physical goods. They stand as the fifth largest e-commerce market globally. Um, they have really one of the highest adoptions of e-commerce anywhere in the world. It's a very technically savvy country. I think 97% of people, 20 to 39, have shopped online in the last year, which is total and complete. You know, despite that high penetration, South Korea's e-commerce market is still rapidly growing. You know, as consumption, they turn to platforms like Coupang and Naver, looking to really even buy a wider range, which is similar to, you know, the patterns that we saw in China. You know, to where people are now buying cars online. E-commerce GMV, I think their growth rates are around 7.3%. You know, and that's a burgeoning market. And really, what the solution that WPIC is in our long-term strategy is to try to bring as many of these platforms into the mix as possible, so we can, you know, have a real single source of inventory, look at advertising campaigns across the APAC region, and assign dollars rapidly using some of the AI systems that we've been built for lower customer acquisition costs. And really just the way that the operation is set up for WPIC, every market that we add in Asia just adds economies of scale. So, you know, the economics get really good the more countries that we operate in. You know, we've been in Japan for 3 years. We've been in Southeast Asia for a little bit more than a year and a half now. And Korea really was the last step in that piece. And now that Coupang and Naver have really emerged as the dominant markets, for years, it was really fragmented. And when you looked at the math and the economics of Korea, you know, having to go on two or three different platforms for an e-commerce market that was maybe more around the $85 billion market, it wasn't a fantastic decision if you could compare, you know, what was going on in Thailand or Japan. But really, now that Coupang has really emerged, they've really started to I'd say, grow into their shoes. Service levels are great, and people really now are concentrated either on Coupang or Naver. For us, that makes a lot of sense now. So things are concentrated in a way that it's now becoming a very profitable market for our brands.
Yeah. Well, that region is certainly raising an eyebrow, but let's take our pencil and circle around Southeast Asia right now. Like
Okay.
Douyin in China, TikTok Shop in Southeast Asia, it's a platform that's really having a ton of success in several markets, probably still the third platform, but it's growing rapidly. I think it's a really interesting play by TikTok to be doing this, and I'm very interested in watching with a lot of interest to see how well they perform. You were recently quoted in Jing Daily, where you described Southeast Asia as a major growth region for online retail. What's the latest in the e-commerce scene in that region?
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing also really good numbers out of our Lazada and Shopee stores right now, much better than we'd expected. So we're very bullish on the region as a whole. Obviously, it covers extremely different markets. We talk about Southeast Asia, and we're really talking roughly about 8 countries. And that's everything from Singapore to Indonesia, where, of course, per capita income is extremely different. You could be on some of the highest, you know, family income and household income in Singapore in the world. And then you get down to, you know, to sort of where you could be in the bottom third. And then you've got countries like Thailand that are, you know, right in the sort of middle class, the right, you know, sweet spot that we look at. But, you know, overall, the growth is incredible. You know, e-commerce sales, I think during the pandemic were like up 50 to 60%, which is incredible. So the rate of adoption is there. And I think that we've all noticed in post pandemics that people who started to shop online, they quite like the experience, and they've really sort of kept that behavior. They're not going back, you know, to their old habits of offline anymore. I think they've realized that, you know, they can get much better pricing when they can compare products and stores and offerings, and that really sort of makes a lot of sense. You know, the competitive landscape in the region is very interesting. You know, the two major players are really the Alibaba-owned Lazada platform and the Tencent-backed Shopee platform. you had regional expert Simon Toring on the podcast this week, and he pointed out, I think the TikTok shop has seized huge market share in the podcast last week. So that was great, especially in the beauty and fashion verticals. It's, I think, the second largest platform in some markets, and that's great. For companies like ours that have really built up good Douyin and TikTok skill sets. The fact that can become a more dominant player in that region is going to give WPIC a really huge advantage. So we're really excited about that. And that's, we're looking also at, TikTok and the rise of that growth, really going to hit the entire world. And we get a lot of calls, now about, even from Europe and the States, where people have understood that this is coming. Well, it's there, but it's going to be a huge deal in the future. It really is, a great way to shop. And I think we talked about this before, not to repeat myself, but mimicking that going to the mall experience, right? That TikTok does really well, where maybe I'm going to go online and I don't know what I'm going to buy right now, but I want people to show me some products. And if I'm interested in something, I'm going to buy it. Whereas maybe more traditional e-commerce platforms, the search, the algorithmic search based, maybe in a lot of cases, we went to that platform with a predetermined intent on what we were going to buy. So a little bit different, sort of experience for the user. And that's why we don't ever expect it. Even as you're seeing TikTok shops rise, it's going to be incremental growth. We don't expect them to be taking really GMV away from any of the established platforms or to inhibit that growth level. This really is kind of a new way to shop. So that if you're on TikTok and you're on Lazada, like I said, if I want a putz or go see a fashion influencer, TikTok's great for that. But if I want this pair of Jimmy Choos, and I know where to get them, I know the store, I'm probably still going to stick to the Shopee Lazada experience.
Okay. 6/18 seems like years ago. We're through summer. Half of Europe has now come back from vacation here in September. Kids are back in school, and we have a flourish of activity leading up through the end of the year. Why don't you break down a little bit of the calendar of events that are going to be happening in China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia? What does the next few months as we, headlong into the end of the year look like?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got major sales now. I mean, Q4 for e-commerce throughout the region is one of the strongest quarters of the year. Certainly in China, it's massive. We've got two of the largest sales here at 11/11, which is going to start on the 31st of October, and then 12/12 right after it. And then rushing into what's also turned out to be a pretty big sale in that New Year's sale now as well. Mm-hmm. So those are big. We've got super sales at Rakuten in Japan coming up in a few weeks. The calendar is really sort of jam packed between now and the end of the year. We really start preparing for 11/11 and what goes on in Q4 just a couple of weeks after 6/18 now. We talk about inventory transfers and using the data that we learned from that S-Class sale to what we can expect in November. So, as inventory's been tight for a lot of brands, we've tried to get as much notice out as possible. So we're expecting record-setting sales numbers in Q4 of this year. And I think at that point, the narrative about the slowing economy and the weak consumption is, I just don't see that, going into 2024. I just can't imagine that narrative coming out with another record-setting 11/11 and you having any credibility left with your viewership at that point.
No, it absolutely isn't. It's going to be one of the most fun areas of the world to pay attention to, even if you're looking for trends or new brands or, checking out what new, AI use cases or, artificial intelligence narratives are going to be created coming out of that region. I think it's going to be a fascinating place for growth and for sales. And I just can't wait for this kind of Q4 to kick off post COVID. It's going to be a really exciting time. So everybody needs to pay attention to that, and everybody needs to pay attention to the WPIC YouTube channel. Lots and lots more content over there. You get a lot of shorts from our podcasts as well. Definitely want to head over and see the WPIC YouTube channel as well. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, don't forget that we have the audio only version on the Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, everywhere you get your podcasts, it's over there. So from me and from everybody, and thanks to Jacob Cooke, the co-founder and CEO of WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Thanks very much for listening and or watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks very much.